Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and friends and inspirational human beings in the house, and welcome to the first anniversary show of the Legacy Show here tonight. The whole purpose, there's a lot of new faces here tonight. There's actually a lot of faces here tonight, which is really exciting. I knew that we had a full house before we walked in, and then people just kept coming in. So it feels like a good college party that I never went to right now. So I was too busy geeking out and doing something else. So now I get to live my college years right here. There'll be beer pong in the back, I'm sure, later from someone on my staff. The theme of tonight is Unfuck Thy Life. And my analogy for the night is sort of, and I thought of this because I went to listen to some music while walking to somewhere the other day, and I pulled my headphones out of my life. I'm like, this is so fucked up. I need to unfuck these right now. And so isn't life sort of like that when you take your iPhone headphones and you put them in your pocket and you pull them out and you're like, how did this even happen in this little ball? And tonight is stories from our role models, right? So we don't even call them speakers or presenters. These are role models. These are people who have done some really kick-ass things in their lifetime, okay? We've all done kick-ass things, right? But now we've got some people who've done some really kick-ass things. And you know what? To do kick-ass things, you've got to fuck up a lot, right? Like, I don't know anybody who's done something kick-ass who hasn't, like, really fucked up a lot. So, you know, there's a risk you've got to take, right? There's a risk that you have to take in order to do meaningful work, okay? There's a risk you have to take if you want to do meaningful work. And that's the purpose of the Legacy Show. Because think about it. Legacy is what you leave behind, right? Legacy what legacy is the ripples that occur that affect people that you never see. And if you really want to leave something great behind, you've got to find that purpose, that voice inside of yourself, right? And so that's why I started putting on this show, because I wanted to introduce more people to highly achieved or successful people, or people with great just journeys in their lives, to show, you know what? The only difference between those who are doing some really kick-ass stuff and those who aren't is they just made a choice. Because what I believe you're going to find tonight, without having spoken to every single role model of the evening, is that they're all scared shitless just like me and just like you, right? You know, we laugh because it's true. So I'd like to bring up one of our first speakers, role models, of the evening. She's written multiple books, which she's going to talk about. So I actually don't want to give too much away, because a lot of the story is going to indicate that. One of the most remarkable people I've ever met. I read her book when I was on vacation, and I will say there is no coincidence that I read your book and we have a sold-out show with a waiting list. Okay? There's no coincidence there. I'd like to introduce you all to Miss Dorie Clark.
Thank you, Michael. So I get asked oftentimes why it is that I moved to New York City. I came here about 2.5 years ago, and people are typically expecting a particular response. They think that I might say, well, you know, I moved for a job, or I moved for a relationship, or I moved because ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to live in the big city, in the big metropolis. But none of those are actually the reason that I moved to New York. The reason I moved to New York was that my cat died, which is the one reason people are not expecting. But allow me to explain. So this, of course, is our big city. Before I moved to New York, I lived in Boston for 17 years. And if any of you are familiar with the differences between the Boston real estate market and the New York real estate market, you'll realize that this was my place in Boston. Yeah, that would cost maybe $10 million to replicate. So it was a big leap for me after so many years to decide to come to New York. But at the time, I had been dating a woman for a couple of years who had moved from New York to be with me in Boston, and she had never really taken to the city. She was an artist, and the artistic community wasn't really what she wanted. In fact, I was trying to encourage her to get out and meet people, and she loved yoga. And so we found a yoga studio near our house in the Boston area, and I suggested she go. And so she went to her first session. And when she came back, I said, well, how was it? And she said, there were only 2 people there. And I said, that's fantastic. You must have gotten, such personal attention. And she burst out in tears and said, where are the people? So it was not a great fit from the beginning. But eventually, after a couple of years, we had some problems in our relationship. And I cared about her enough to want to do everything I could to try to make the relationship work. And she had said all along, if only we were in New York, things would be different, things would be better. And so I believed her, at least enough to try. And so the day after Christmas, 2012, we moved to Brooklyn. We moved to this little apartment. And within a week, we had broken up. Which, as you know, is how all real estate in New York works. For an additional 2 months, an additional 2 uncomfortable months, we engaged in a real estate proxy war in which I said, I'm happy to stay here and you can move out, or you can keep the apartment and I can move out. And she said, how about neither? How about you can pay for me to stay here? I was not so cool with that. But after a terrible 2-month stalemate, she finally said, just go. And I did. But I wasn't sure where to go to. My condo in Boston hadn't rented yet because it was still the dead of winter. So I decided to head back to Boston. And it was okay. I was glad to be back in my comfortable, familiar environment. But the one thing that was extraordinarily sad to me was that in the process of this breakup, I lost custody of this little girl. Her name was Harriet, and Harriet had been my former partner's cat, but over the past 2 years, she had become my cat. She'd become my daughter. That was the way that I thought about her. And I'll tell you, a lesbian breakup is really bad when the parting words are, if you want to see the cat, you can pay child support. So I haven't seen the cat in a while. That was extremely sad to me. But the one thing that really made it bearable was that I had someone else in my life. And that was this guy. His name is Gideon. And Gideon was my cat that I had had since I was 18 years old. I had adopted Giddy while I was volunteering at the Massachusetts SPCA. And I was going through and walking through the cages, and I came by his cage, and he reached out his paw through the bars and touched my face and claimed me. And I said, okay, if you say so, you're mine, and I'm yours. And we had become incredibly close since then. I mean, this picture doesn't even show up, but let me show you another one. This cat's a fucking baller. He's got the big paws. He owns the world. But it wasn't just his attitude that made Giddy special. I'll tell you a couple of things that happened to me. One night, it was January in Boston. It was a cold evening, and I had just gotten home, and I heard a noise outside. It sounded like scraping. And that was not unusual in Boston in January because people were constantly scraping off their cars and shoveling and trying to get the ice out. So I didn't think anything of it. But the scraping persisted, and I was in my bedroom, and I looked over into the living room, and I saw Gideon, and he had puffed up like a porcupine. His fur was on end, and he was enormous, standing in the living room, just looking and watching, and then looking at me and trying to get my attention. I was on the phone, and I said to the person I was talking to, hold on, I got to see what's going on. And when I walked out into my living room, I caught sight of what Gideon had seen, which was a man halfway through my kitchen window. I ran towards him and started screaming and swearing at him. And fortunately, he was just enough outside the window that it was easier for him to flee than it was to come in and try to fight me. But Gideon saved my life that night. But that wasn't all that he did. Gideon was also an acute judge of character. And he saved me from bad relationships. One night when I had finished graduate school, I had just graduated, and I had gone away on a trip to Europe. And I had a friend coming in and watching Giddy while I was away. So I arrived home, and Gideon had timed it perfectly. Because if he had done this earlier in the trip, my friend would have cleared it away. I never would have known. But he knew when I was coming back, and he knew what I would discover. I had been dating someone that summer. And I had, back in the day, back in the pre-iPhone day, I had a photograph of us together. And it was a printed out photograph, not in a frame or anything. I had leaned it against a bookshelf. And in my absence, while I was traveling, Gideon had knocked it down onto the floor, and he had bitten through her. I said, Giddy, is this a message? And he was quiet. But a few weeks later, his prescience was borne out, because what I discovered was that this woman, we got into a fight. And she actually said to me, as we were fighting, she said, Dorie, you know what your problem is? She said, your problem is a lack of character. She said, it's a lack of character because you let your cat jump on the counters. And as she was saying this, we were leaving my apartment to go out for the evening. And I was locking the door, and she was turning to face me, and she was speaking to me as she was walking down the steps. And as she said this, she tripped and sprained her ankle. That was when I realized that God is a cat. But this is a picture that was taken in November of 2013. And unfortunately, it was a picture that was taken just a few days before Giddy died. He was diagnosed with a fast-moving cancer, and unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of time to say goodbye. But that was a selfie that I took. And during that period, and it's even now hard to talk about, but during that period, I became extraordinarily sad. And I came to realize that in our culture, and part of why I'm talking about it tonight, is that we don't talk enough about pets. We don't talk enough about what that kind of loss means. And I think too often people who don't have animals in their lives or who haven't don't understand exactly how it feels, or that it can be as important or sometimes even more important than if a human with whom sometimes we have complicated or difficult relationships might die. Because for animals, it is unconditional love. It is a kind of love that teaches you how to give and receive in a way that we can't necessarily with people, but which can serve as a model for what we should aspire to do. And so I wanted to just tell you briefly a few lessons that I've learned from this process of grieving and growing in the 3 years since Giddy died. So, first, don't be too hard on yourself. This is a picture of the Harvard Club. That is one of my favorite places in New York City. A few months after Giddy died, I was single then, and so I had a date. I had an online date, and there was an event at the Harvard Club that I had heard about that sounded cool. It was a woman talking about narrative medicine, And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And so I was going to meet up with this woman, and I suggested, why don't we go to this event? I figured, let's have an activity, and then we'll have something to talk about. So we met and went to the activity, but what I didn't realize was this talk about narrative medicine actually really meant that a woman who wanted to talk about her work in helping physicians deal with death and dying and communicate that to their patients. And so on my first date, I started very, very quietly bawling. And I tried to keep calm and just, so many contact problems. But at the end of the talk, I said to the woman, because, she had arrived just before. We really hadn't had time to visit. I said, would you like to go downstairs and get a drink or have some food? And she said, no, I'm sorry. I need to go home to feed my cat. So you have to be gentle. The next thing that I learned, progress is measured by the interval between breakdowns. When Gideon first died, multiple times a day, I would burst out crying. I would think he was there. I would see him around every corner. And in fact, that is the real reason that I decided to move to New York. Because I realized that you think of your cat in the place that you know your cat, the place that you have spent time with your cat, and that is your house. You don't think of your cat when you're on vacation. You don't think of your cat when you're out at a bar. You think of your cat at home. And when I walked around my home and I didn't see him, I became so incredibly sad and depressed. I decided I needed to do something about it. And so I sold my house. And I said, if I'm going to sell my house, I don't want to just move down the block. I want to change my life. And I want to finish what I started. And so I felt like New York was an open loop in my life that had ended before it began. And I decided it was time to correct that and to close that loop. And so eventually I went from crying multiple times a day to crying just once a day to crying every other day to only crying when I really thought about Gideon to finally now I can maybe get through this talk without crying. Third lesson that I learned, it's okay to distract yourself. During 2014, the year after he died, I gave 61 talks. I am a writer and a professional speaker. I spent most of my time traveling. In 2015, I launched this book, and I gave 74 talks that year. Eventually, I decided that was enough, and I have cut back and tried to, develop a more rational schedule so that I can develop more of a personal life. But for a while, I was running away, and it was okay because that's better than crack. The fourth lesson is that it won't really necessarily be the same. I was so worried about some people would say, well, just get another cat. But I didn't want a rebound cat. I didn't want some other cat and just, a few months later I'm like, oh, this cat isn't any good. It was just a rebound cat. It would be a disservice to Gideon. It would be a disservice to them. I wanted to be sure I was ready. And so I started actually visiting cat cafes. They have a few of them here in New York. But honestly, sometimes I got even more depressed going to the cat cafe because you go there and there's 10 humans fighting to play with 3 cats. The cats have seen people the last 9 hours. They say, who the fuck are you? And it felt a little sad. But I realized it's different when it's your cat. And I knew that it would feel different. It would feel better. I had to believe that. And finally, I learned that you do have to operate on your own timeline. I had thought initially maybe a year after he died, I would get another cat. But I wasn't ready. Even then, I wasn't ready. But this past summer, I was doing Pilates. I was at a Pilates studio in Union Square. And after I finished my workout, I decided, just because, that I would go across the street to the Petco, where they have adoptable cats. And I would just take a peek. I would just see who was there. And I had done it before, and all the cats just looked at me and said, "Who the fuck are you?" But on this day, on this Sunday, after my Pilates class, a little kitten reached through the cage and touched my head. And I said, "I got it." And I brought him home. This is my new family. The little kitty who reached out and touched me is Heath, who is also known as Sink Cat. This is his brother Philip. They were both the last kittens in their litters, and I brought them home, and they've become best friends. They spend all their time together. They love each other. They love hanging out in the sink. They're little boys, and they love to wrestle. And more than anything, they love to hug. So that was how I was able to overcome and to heal, and that's why I moved to New York. Thank you.
First off, just so you know, I like sitting in the sink too. I'm called Sink Husband. So I have two questions, and the first one's not for you. The first one is for my wife. Now can we have a cat? Now can we have a cat? We're not telling the story. Don't worry. I thought about it. I'm not telling the story. All right. Another question is for you. I love cats, and we don't have a cat. So if you change your mind. So here's the question I have for you to wrap up. First off, talk about, you have another book. You talked about Stand Out, which is the book I read. I loved it. Great book. Fantastic book. And can it be found where?
Yeah, many bookstores, or you can always get it on Amazon or online, right. Barnes & Noble.
And just give it a quick plug so people know what it's about now that they heard you talking. If they like what you have to say, maybe they want to hear more of what you have to say.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah. I appreciate it. So my first book, Reinventing You, is if you're changing careers or looking to do that, it is a guidebook for how to do that. It came out from Harvard Business Review Press. And Stand Out, my most recent book, is about how to become known as among the best in your field. So if you're in the process of making a change and a transition, Reinventing You is the book for you. And if you are where you want to be, but you just want to get bigger, better known, dominate, then Stand Out.
That's great. No, and it's awesome that you want to share. The vulnerability you need to share that kind of information is awesome, because it sounds like you had to reinvent yourself in multiple times in your life too, with the cats and everything. So the one question is, if you're in pain, whether it's a death of a person or it's a loss of a job, a loss of something, right? You're in so much pain. A lot of people might look at the lack they have, everything they don't have. So how do you focus on what you do have? How do you look to say, what are the lessons I've learned from the loss of my kitty, right? Or of loss of whatever it is. So how, instead of going, I'm going to go dwell in a cave somewhere, what do you do?
Well, I think in some ways maybe I'm a role model because at least I got through it. But in some ways I'm probably not a role model, in that I probably should have seen a therapist, but instead I worked. So that is a viable strategy. I don't know if it's the advisable one, but but for me, we all have sort of our go-to mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And for me, work was something that I like to do and was comforting to me. And so I did at the time realize, okay, maybe it's not so healthy to be working so much, but I really did just sort of look at it as the alternative, like,
it's better than crack.
Better than crack.
Better than
booze, yeah.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Dorie Clark, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
All right. So our next role model is a storyteller here in the city. She's an award.